everyone can listen to me correctly. We are starting this webinar today, and hello, welcome to the launch of this webinar series organized by the Green Jobs Assessment Institutions Network. My name is Adrià Rius Rodriguez, and I'm part of the GAIN team and also the Green Jobs program here at the ILO. And I'm pleased today to facilitate this session. Now, before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. First, this webinar is recorded and we will upload the recording soon after we finish. Second, you are listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, the dial-in information will be in the chat. And third, you might send in your questions at any time during the session, and please do so. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, having said this, I would like to introduce the context of the webinar. The session topic for today is on modeling the employment outcomes of achieving the 2 degrees Celsius long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, which has been investigated in the recently launched ILO flagship publication, The World Employment and Social Outlook. The WESO 2018 report offers a comprehensive study of the relationship between employment and the environment from different angles. As part of the report, the input-output methodology was used as an analytical tool to model the scenario of a sustainable economic development model, including achieving the 2 degrees target of the Paris Agreement and therefore the effort required in the energy sector, also the transition to sustainable agriculture, and finally the adoption of the principles of the circular economy. In particular, today's session will focus on the 2 degrees target. On the one hand, it will present the methodology used to undertake such a scenario modeling, and on the other hand, it will present the results and policy implications. Now, having said this, I would like to proceed to present the agenda for the session today. As you can see, we will first have an introductory note on the Green Jobs Assessment Institutions Network, which will be given by your first speaker, Mustafa Kamal Gueye. After this introductory note, Kirsten Svenja-Wiebe and Guillermo Montt will present on today's session's topic. This will be a joint presentation that will link the context of the WESO report with the methodological underpinnings of the conclusions reached in such report. Accordingly, Guillermo will first introduce the context of the study to then give floor to Kirsten. Kirsten will present on the methodology, therefore helping our attendees to better understand the background exercise of the WESO report results on modeling the impact of reaching the 2 degrees long-term goal. Finally, we will go back to Guillermo, who will present the results of such methodology. Now we are therefore pleased to provide our attendees with such a dynamic and engagement presentation, and we hope that today's session will help you to understand better the usefulness and expected results of using the input-output methodology. Now, after the presentation, we will turn to the Q&A session, and as I mentioned before, please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the session. We expect the time of the webinar to be between 45 minutes and 1 hour. Now, before proceeding, let me introduce our experts and speakers today. As mentioned earlier, the first speaker will be Mustafa Kamal Gueye. Kamal is the coordinator of the Green Jobs program of the ILO and has previously served as the head of the Green Economy Advisory Service at the UN Environment, a senior program manager of environment at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development in Geneva. Earlier, Kamal spent 12 years across Asia, managing policy research projects on renewable energy, environment, and sustainable development. Kamal holds a PhD from Nagoya University in Japan and Masters from Nagoya and Dakar Universities. Our next speaker is Guillermo Montt. Guillermo is Senior Economist at the Research Department of the ILO, where he leads research on the relationship between employment, decent work, and the transition to a green economy. Prior to joining the ILO, Guillermo worked for the OECD at the Directorate of Education and Skills and the Directorate for Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs. He holds a PhD in Sociology from the University of Notre Dame. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce our third speaker, Kirsten Wiebe. Kirsten is currently working as a researcher at the Industrial Ecology Program of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and is also an active member of the International Input-Output Association. During her post at the NTNU, she has collaborated closely with the ILO, and her work on economic scenario modeling has been a major contribution to the WESO report. Previously, Kirsten has also collaborated with other recognized institutions such as the OECD, where she worked on OECD's inter-country input-output tables. Kirsten holds a PhD from the United Nations University Institute and bachelor and master's degree from the Maastricht University. And now, after introducing the agenda and also the speakers, without further ado, I would like to thank the audience for your attention and participation, and I'm honored to give the floor to Mustafa. Mustafa, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Drea, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues, for joining us on this launch of the GAN Network webinar series. I just would like to, first of all, introduce the Green Job Assessment Institutions Network. The network was launched several years ago and started to be active in 2013. It was set up with primary two objectives. One was to rally a number of organizations and policy research institutions from around the world that we know are interested in measuring labor market impacts of policies dealing with climate change, the greening of the economies, and sustainable development in general, so that we work as a technical network to share experiences on assessment tools, methodologies, and experiences. And then second, to use this network as a vehicle for capacity building. We, in our experience working with countries interested in assessments, that we have found that there are many instances where governments are interested to conduct such assessments and to do that with national institutions in their countries. But sometimes those national institutions do not necessarily have the technical capacity to undertake such assessments, and therefore we've used the GAN network to foster collaborative research and assessment modeling work. So therefore, since its launch in 2013, GAN has evolved as a small network into a larger group of very solid, renowned organizations. We organize international conferences on a biennial basis, and we had our last international conference on December 2017 at the ILO headquarters in Geneva. And I wanted to also say that regarding the first objective of the network to develop assessment tools and methodologies, one of our objectives was to come up with a tool which is capturing the various methodologies that have been employed in country assessments, from input-output to statistical approaches, social accounting, and models in general, into what you have now on the screen, which is this guidebook called How to Measure and Model Social and Employment Outcomes of Climate Change and Sustainable Development Policies. So this GAN training guidebook took 2 years to develop, but what we are very proud in this process is that the development of the training guidebook was an effort, a collective effort by members of our GAN network. So we therefore have a common and collective ownership of this product, and this is what we now intend to use as a tool for the capacity building support of the GAN network. Now, in order to promote and undertake such capacity building effort, we're hoping to rely on all of you colleagues, members of the network, but to set up what we call GAN training hubs. So idea is that what we have discussed among the network is to set up regional training hubs with the start in Africa. We have the University of Pretoria, one of our GAN members, that is engaging with us to help us establish the first training hub for Africa. And the intention is that that training hub will be used as a platform for training institutions and policy organizations in the Africa region, and we hope to move with that same approach in Asia and Latin America, where we have expression of interest from GAN members to play that function of a training hub. Now, one element that we have also focused on and discussed in our last international conference is that up until now, GAIN has been a more or less loose network of institutions having a common interest in assessment and quantitative studies, but we have felt that we have reached a level of critical mass that requires some forms of organizational structure. Therefore, we have agreed in our last conference that we will more or less formalize the GAIN network, define rules of engagement, and we have, many of you colleagues have received a formal notification and invitation to formally become a member of the network so that we become more formalized and operate not really as a legal entity as such, but at least have something that is better than what we had up until now as a loose network. So you see that we have a very wide membership from analytical policy research institutions, the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Geneva, in Switzerland, IGS in Asia, Cambridge Econometrics, University of Victoria. So many of you colleagues that we are very proud and pleased to be working with together in our effort to build capacity and support our member countries better understand the employment and social outcome of their policies in the areas of climate change and sustainable development. So therefore, part of this formalization of the GAIN network is this new webinar series that we hope will allow us on a regular basis to interact, to take stock of work that is going on within the network and with our member countries, to help ourselves in technical review of assessments and modeling work that we are doing, and also look at options to expand this network to make it more relevant to the need of our member countries and partners that we work with. So Adria, these are some of the points that I wanted to just raise as we start the call. So again, thank you so much for leading this process with Marek and for all of our colleagues to join us on this launch of the webinar series. So over to you, Adria.
Thanks a lot, Kamal. Mustafa, thank you very much for this presentation. Let me just remind our attendees that more information on GAIN, including the website, will be provided at the end of this presentation. Now, following our agenda, we're going to start discussing the session's topic. So we will hand the presentation over to Guillermo to start the presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Guillermo.
Thank you, Adria, and thank you all for joining. I'm Guillermo from the ILO, as Adria mentioned. And just before I get started, I wanted to mention to you all that up in the top right corner, you have a chat button, and feel free to send your questions in. We have a Q&A session at the end of Kristen's and my presentation. So to get this in the ILO, a few months ago, we released the report, the World Employment and Social Outlook, that focuses on greening with jobs. It is particularly interesting for this group and for the GAIN network because it applies the input-output methodology to assess what sustainability, the impacts addressing sustainability will have in employment and the world of work. So the report and our work more generally starts from the fact that current economic activity is to a large extent unsustainable. And this is reflected in the fact that we have air, water, soil pollution, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, and a long and unfortunate list of et ceteras that include greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Now, these issues have been summarized quite nicely by the idea of 9 planetary boundaries, 2 of which have already been breached, causing most likely irreversible harm to the Earth system. Now, one of these that has not been breached but is close to reaching that threshold is greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Now, the core of this issue is that we have not figured out a sustainable development model. The graph that you can see in your screens right now plots all countries. Each dot is one country. The colors reflect the regions they belong to. And it plots their Human Development Index against their ecological footprint. The ecological footprint measures the environmental impact of each country, and we see that there's quite a positive relationship between development and the ecological footprint. We have not figured out how to be developed with a low ecological footprint. Now, there's a small square at the bottom right, which is basically countries that are in that area are developed but also ecologically sustainable. And now in that area right now, we have only 2 countries that barely make it. And you might be surprised to know which they are. They are the Dominican Republic and Sri Lanka. The rest are either not developed or have a high ecological footprint. So at the core of this issue, and the main takeaway from this, is that we need to move into a sustainable development model. And for many reasons. One is that jobs and from the perspective of the world of work, environmental sustainability is important. With environmental degradation comes many problems, which are loss of productivity because of heat stress or loss of ecosystem services, which are at the basis of economic activity that sustains jobs. But environmental degradation also brings inequality, which makes sustainability a core issue for advancing social justice. Now, when we advance sustainability, we're basically talking about a structural transformation. Some scholars have equated it to an industrial revolution because sustainability touches all sectors. But it touches particularly the list that we have on the screen: agriculture, fisheries, manufacturing, buildings and construction, forestry, energy, waste management, and transportation. But by the mere fact that these sectors are linked to other sectors in the economy, advancing sustainability in one of these is going to have indirect effects on everyone else. And that is why the input-output methodology is particularly interesting, because if we focus on sustainability in one sector, we can see how the indirect effects appear and affect the whole economy. So for this context, in this context, one of the main questions we address in the report and the analysis that we carry out is, what does a transition mean for the world of work? Now, a transition can mean many things, and it's an abstract term that in practice means, for us, we narrow it down to 3 scenarios. So what does a transition to sustainability in energy mean for the world of work? And we also explore agriculture, resource waste management, and we're currently doing similar exercises for fisheries and for transport. Now, in this presentation, we will focus mostly on energy because it's of a global interest, and we focus on the scenario of taking action in the energy sector to meet the 2-degree goal set out in the Paris Agreement. So in practice, what we do is use the multi-regional input-output tables projected to 2030, adjust the coefficients to capture technological change and changes in demand that will allow for achieving the 2-degree goal, and compare the employment impact, the employment in that scenario of energy sustainability to what would be expected in a business as usual. Now, Kirsten will shortly pick up the ball and describe in much more detail and much more comprehensively what this means. But I want you to keep in mind as we describe the methodology and as we describe the results, that underlying this are many assumptions. So we can talk about them later, but some of them include that relative prices remain the same, that there will be no changes to the trade structure around the world, that there are no frictions in the labor market to adjust to changes in labor demand, and in our models in particular, that there are no changes to labor productivity. Now, I'll hand the ball over to to Kirsten, who will describe these issues, the methodological aspect and what we have done in more detail, and then I'll pick up again for the results. And as a quick reminder, if you have any questions, you can write them down in the chat. We'll take good note of them, and then we can address them in the session as we have the time. So, Adria, I hand the ball over to you to hand it over to Kirsten again. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Guillermo, for setting the stage. Now I hand it in to Kirsten.
I'm Kirsten Wiebe from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and as Guillermo and Adria mentioned, I'm going to talk the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'll try to keep it short, and I'll try to explain to you in a not too technical manner the methodology that we use to calculate the scenarios that Guillermo has mentioned. There's another interactive way that you can participate here, and we're just going to test this now because I would like to know how many of you have seen or worked with input-output tables before. And apparently in the participants section in the top right corner, if you select participants, you can click on a little hand next to your name and raise your hand if you've worked or seen an IO table before. I don't see any hands.
I raised my hand, Kirsten. This is Guillermo.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I can see your hand. Oh, 2, 3, 4, 5 more. Okay. Then I think I will start with explaining some more basic input-output methodology to you. So a multi-regional input-output table is basically the same as a national table. I'll walk you through this graph on the top, on the left side of this slide now. So the red squares on the left represent a multi-regional input-output table, and there's little squares for each country and the interrelations between each country. So if you look at the top, can you see my mouse? I don't know. If you look at the top row of squares, region A row and column region B, that represents the imports of region B coming from region A. And similarly, the dark red square on the very top left is all the intermediate products produced in region A and consumed within region A. So it's within each square, there's a lot more data points, 163 by 163 in our case, that show the inter-industry linkages within the region and then also the imports from the other regions. So region A, let's say it's Austria, uses inputs, and then the first industry, for example, agriculture, uses inputs not only from the agriculture industry within the country or from other countries, like for example, from Belgium or Canada, like seeds to actually plant grains, but they also use machinery and equipment like the tools to harvest the grains. So every industry is interlinked through trade within other industries in the same country and in other countries. The light green part below the red squares represents the factor inputs. That is capital and labor inputs. You need to pay your workers. So this is part of the inputs into the production of an industry as well. The orange parts represent the final demand for products. And also there's final demand products that are traded. So with the dark orange parts are those products that are the final products produced in your own country or region that are consumed by domestic customers, while those in the light parts represent imports in the column or exports in the rows. And then the last part is the dark, it's represented by the dark green rectangles, and it's data that is related to industrial production. So how many people are employed at which skill level in that industry, in that country? how much CO2 is emitted in that industry in that country, how much material is extracted by that industry in that country. So that the main result of this analysis is that we get are the environmental or socioeconomic impacts in one region, that's the regions in the rows, caused by the demand. In the other regions, that's the regions in the columns in the blue part, in the blue matrix shown on the right. As Guillermo said before, one of the big virtues in using this methodology is that you're able to not only see the direct effects of whatever you do, but also the indirect effects that occur in other industries and in other countries or world regions. I'll just skip over this one. Currently, we have 5 global multi-regional import-output systems or databases. The Global Trade Analysis Project, that was one of the first ones. Then we have the institutionalized OECD Intercountry Import-Output Table, which is updated and regularly updated, while the other 3, the WIAT, the EORA, and the XIO-base, are academia-based databases, so from university that always have to apply for project money to keep them going. But so far it's been going great, and all those databases are still alive and updated. We've chosen to use XIO-base for this analysis because it has the highest industry and product resolution, which is important if we look at these specific scenarios of waste and resource management. Agriculture, it has 15 agricultural industries, and energy that Guillermo introduced earlier. So how are we projecting the system into the future? So what we do is are simple what-if type scenarios. That means that we just change very few parts of the system while going to the future, one year at a time. It's we say it's just a simple forward-looking version of XIO-base, but it is not a forecasting tool for the entire world economy. It is a multi-regional supply and use table or import-output table calibrated to meet the specifications of existing scenarios. We're focusing on the IEA, International Energy Technology Perspective Scenario, as Guillermo mentioned before, but we're planning to also implement the RCP or SSP scenarios that are used by the integrated assessment modeling community as well. Compared to the scenario and the scenario data that's supplied by the IEA directly is that we have more industry and more product detail, and we can represent and calculate direct and indirect effects. So projecting a table like this into the future requires actually predicting its components. If you remember the first schematic representation that I showed you, we have 163 industries in 44 countries and 5 regions. That means that that means that for every year we have more than 8,000 by 8,000 data points. So we have chosen to concentrate on a few parts of the matrix that we will project and that where we're assessing the change over time, and that's the final demand. So total household consumption, total government consumption, total investment per country. For household consumption, we're also assuming some changes in the structure of the consumption using income elasticities. For investment, we're only assuming the changes in the structure that are relevant for the scenarios. That means relevant for the investment into renewable energies. And then also we're changing the associated environmental and socioeconomic stresses. As Guillermo mentioned before, we have to assume that some things just remain constant. The bilateral trade shares at the product level, that means that the global trade structure still changes, but at the product level, the import shares remain constant. We are calculating everything in constant prices, and we are not considering any price effects. And we don't have any changes in the labor productivity in the results that we show today. We're currently trying to implement some basic labor productivity changes. Let's see how that goes. And output and value added are endogenous to the model. Okay, this graph is quite complicated and involving to explain. It's just a representation of where in the table that I showed earlier the most important changes occur for the example of the diffusion of a low carbon technology. So for example, for an increased share of wind electricity in the system. This graph is also explained in the book chapter that I wrote. The reference is there, so you can go back to that chapter and read it slowly and in detail. So the most important changes to remember is that you have to increase investment into that technology. So more investment into wind turbines. These wind turbines will need to be built. That means that the structure of the machinery and equipment industry changes. In countries where this industry is small, like in Denmark, it changes the entire industry structure. In Germany, for example, the industry structure would only change very little. Then there's more wind turbines that are used. So the structure of the electricity industry changes. Less coal, more wind, more maintenance for wind farms, for example. Then the emission intensity of electricity production, of course, changes. And then indirectly in the model, implicitly, the value added and output changes. So I think I need to speed up a bit. So I'm just going to introduce the main facts of the IEA Energy Technology Perspective scenario, which is implemented as exogenous information into our model. We've implemented the 6-degree, the 4-degree, and the 2-degree scenario. The 6-degree scenario is the baseline scenario. We're not looking at the 4-degree scenario, we're just looking at the more extreme version of the 2-degree scenario. All of these scenarios have the same underlying economic projections. That means that all the changes we see are not effects because the global GDP is different. It's only the effects that occur in the global economic structure due to the changes in the energy system. So the main difference between the scenarios is the final energy demand by industry, transport, buildings, agriculture, fishing, and other industries. It's not only the total energy demand, but also the structure, the fuel inputs of the energy demand. And also we included some additional information on electric transport and on energy efficiency improvements in buildings. Those are implicitly described those are described in the scenarios, but in our model we implemented in a way that to get the energy efficiency improvements, so the savings from the energy efficiency improvements had to be spent on the construction sector to increase the energy efficiency of the buildings. This just shows you that the 6-degree scenario for the EU on the left and the world in the middle, the different fuels that go into gross electricity generation. So for the EU, we can see that in 2030, more than 50% of the fuels going into gross electricity generation comes from low carbon sources, while on the world average, this is only 35%. In the 2-degree scenario, it's also on the global average 55% low carbon fuels that go into electricity generation. This picture is very similar when we also look on other energies that are used, as you can see in this table. You can also see in this table that in both the OECD countries and the non-OECD countries, primary energy demand and total final energy demand are significantly lower in the 2-degree scenario than in the 6-degree scenario, while the absolute value of renewables used is increasing significantly. And I think this brings me to summarizing. So we've implemented the scenario specifications as exogenous drivers for the changes in our IO table, in our global IO table. And we should always interpret the outcomes of the what-if scenarios relative to each other, not in absolute terms, as many more things may change in the future compared than what we've actually than the changes that we've actually implemented here. The results that we see show what might happen if these changes are implemented without any other counteracting or flanking policy measures. So it is important to do this type of analysis to see potential positive and negative outcomes, to be able to design these flanking measures. And then last but not least, I would like to stress the importance of the fact that the assumptions of constant structures, if we don't have any better information available, is only valid in the short to medium run. Economic and trade structures may change significantly in the future, and currently we, so Guillermo, Marek, and my colleagues Moana Simas and Richard Wood have no means to completely correctly predict these other changes, so we've just reduced our analysis to what I presented here. And also we have the paper that describes this methodology forthcoming in the special issue on environmentally extended input-output modeling in the Journal of Economic Structure. Thank you, and back to Guillermo for the presentation of the results.
Thanks a lot, Kristen. And now, as mentioned, I hand the presentation to Guillermo to present on policy implications and the results of using this methodology. Please, just a reminder that we're collecting questions, so feel free to write your questions at any moment. Thank you, and over to you, Guillermo.
There we go. Sorry, I had my microphone on mute. Thank you, Adria. Thank you, Kirsten. So, implementing the model and the scenario that Kirsten described, which is in a nutshell, an increase in energy efficiency and an increase in the share of renewables in the energy matrix to achieve the 2-degree goal, leaves us at the possibility of calculating what total employment gains and total employment losses for each of the countries and each of the industries and regions that we have in Exaiobase. So in this graph that you see, we have the overall employment creation, the net effect that we would expect if when comparing the 2-degree scenario with the 6-degree scenario. So we see over at the whole world scale, which is the green bar to the right, we see unemployment creation of almost 0.3% of net new jobs created. This is equivalent to 18 million jobs in 2030. So basically the 2-degree scenario is compatible and predicts more jobs in the economy when compared to the business as usual scenario. Now this is the result of jobs created in not only in the renewable sector, but particularly in the construction sector, as I will describe a bit later. Now, importantly, there are differences by region, and you'll see in the graph that the Middle East is one of the hardest hit, and that's because of the reliance on fossil fuels for their whole economy. The same is true for Africa. So the main lesson here is, and back to the assumptions that we have in these models, is that basically production and trade structures remain relatively similar, is that unless these regions diversify, they will see employment losses because of the reliance on fossil fuels for their economy and employment as a whole. Now, employment gains are expected in the Americas, Asia and the Pacific, and Europe. So overall, on the very aggregate context, the 2-degree scenario is compatible with employment creation. So the idea that energy sustainability is a job killer, that climate action is a job killer, that is basically not true. Our analysis proved quite the contrary. Now, if we go at the country level, we see quite some different scenarios, and I only present certain countries here which are relatively large and for which we have data at the country level. So employment creation for Japan, for example, is estimated at 1.25%, and the Middle East at as described earlier, at far lower and negative. So that is equivalent to around 300,000 jobs. Now, net employment creation and net employment destruction is, of course, a very relevant issue, but we want to know exactly what happens at the sectoral level as well, to see which sectors are the ones that will see the greater demand. And this is important when we need to devise, for example, skills policies, because if jobs are created there, we need workers with the particular skills to meet that demand. So our estimates show that the construction sector is one of the ones that will grow the most, with 6.5 million jobs created around the world, and also the manufacture of electrical machinery and apparatus, as well as mining of copper ores and concentrates. Now, construction. Why are these sectors those that grow the most? Construction is quite intuitive because of the relationship to achieving energy efficiency. When we promote energy efficiency in existing buildings, basically that means retrofitting, and that is a boost to the construction sector. The manufacture of electrical machinery and apparatus, as well as the mining of copper ores, as Kirsten described in the example of wind farms, is basically to provide inputs to the development of renewables. And then we have as well other sectors like the production of electricity by hydro, the cultivation of vegetables, all this, and electricity by solar, all this goes for the production of renewable energy. Which sectors will see the most job losses? They're all related to the fossil fuel-based industry. So these are, although they are linked to the rest of the economy, the biggest effects are in the sector themselves. And this is very important to note from policy perspective, because these workers will need support, and these firms will need support to make sure that the transition towards energy sustainability is just for all. Now, we want a transition that I think we can all agree, but we should also agree on the fact that we need to protect workers who will lose out from the transition. And overall, there's that I was just mentioning the results for the net employment effects. But when we think about a transformation like that of towards energy sustainability, there's a lot of reallocation going on. Jobs in one sector disappear, but also appear in another sector. Overall, we see a net positive effect, like I just described, but there's a lot of internal movement that net effect doesn't capture. So this is why we also focus on excess reallocation between sectors, and we see that the results are quite distinct, and they merit attention as well from a policy perspective, because these internal movements of jobs require, to a large extent, reskilling and matching exercises that do not come in and by themselves. Now, these results are not in the VESO. We are developing them now for a paper that we're working on. So this is actually, you're the first people to see these results. And if you would have noticed in the previous slides, the Russian Federation had from a net employment gain perspective, had a very little, would see a very little effect in terms of job destruction. But when we look at it from the perspective of excess reallocation, there's a movement between jobs across industries that the Russian Federation actually does see an effect. So it will be touched quite importantly by the transition. And all this is basically analyzed through the input-output methodology that Kirsten described. Now, so what does this all mean? I've introduced very slightly what policy implications they are, but the big takeaway point from our analysis is that the 2-degree goal has the potential to create more new jobs than those that will be destroyed. So importantly, advancing the 2-degree goal is not a job killer, but rather quite the contrary. But there's important reallocation, even in countries that may not see high levels of job destruction of job or net job creation. There will still be important reallocation, and importantly, there's also some regions and some countries that will see net job destruction. So what does this mean for policy? One, it means many things for policies to make the transition happen and realize the scenarios as we've seen them, which means policies to promote the transition, the adoption of energy efficiency and renewables, That could include carbon pricing, phasing of carbon subsidies, industrial policy and innovation in specific sectors, social dialogue, and also labor market policies to facilitate the transition for workers from one sector to another. Again, we assume in this scenario that the labor market is quite fluid, and that may not be the case in all countries. And it's also a set of policies to ensure that this transition brings more jobs, and particularly decent jobs with it. Now, that's not necessarily the case, and that's why these scenarios to be achieved in a context of decent work need to be complemented by support to firms and workers who lose out so that they can adapt to the new industrial landscape. This includes skills development and social protection policies, and ensure that all the new jobs that are created that have or satisfy the criteria for being decent work, decent jobs. And that's why the normative framework that regulates these new industries, these new jobs, needs to be carefully followed as well. So that, in a nutshell, that's very quick, and I'm not doing giving these policies the merit they deserve in terms of nuance, but I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A session, and you're more than welcome to look at the development of these in the report that we wrote. And here's the link, and also my appreciation for your attention. And here's our contact information in case you have any questions. If you want to follow up later, we're more than welcome to continue the conversation. And with that, I hand it over to you, Adria.
Thanks a lot, Guillermo and Kristen, for this insightful presentation. And now, please feel free to ask questions. We'll just give some few seconds also for us to organize the questions. So in just a few seconds, we will start the Q&A. And please feel free to start typing your questions. So we can start maybe with a question from Tomo Machiba, who maybe it's more directed to Kristen, and he's asking that he says we are participating from the UAE, and the country doesn't have input-output table, and the table used in international database like ExIOBase or GTAP is very inaccurate. So he's asking, in that case, how is the exercise useful? Kristen, I'm giving you the control.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. It's actually a very important and very valid question, because there's a lot of countries, especially from non-OECD countries, that are not well represented in these global databases. And in ExIOBase, we have just 5 aggregated world regions. So the industry structure in these regions is clearly not valid for all the countries in these regions. It's an estimated average. But I still think for the region, not for the individual countries, because they're not there, it's still valid to do this analysis, because the trade data for the past is still correct. So even if we would include the UAE as an individual country in the database, and we have the current trade structure, the current outputs, it can still give us an indication of the trends of possible changes. But yes, to increase the representation, I think that's something that the GAIN people at ILO actually can support or want to support, is that there's more countries in the world that actually have IO tables, and if there's more national IO tables available, we can integrate them into the global databases. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kirsten. Now we have another question from Coach Lavis, who's asking if there are any guidelines developed for job creation and employment measurement in Europe, following, I guess, the input-output methodology, and if not, to what extent are the guidelines that we have developed with WESO report, to what extent does this guideline fit for the European region? Guillermo, I give the floor to you.
Yeah, so let me check that I'm, so from the ILO perspective, we have the guidelines for a just transition, and our main concern is that not only that new jobs are created, but that these are decent. So in the specific analysis that we carried out, we only focus on the employment numbers, not on the job quality. And I saw there was another question on this issue. And in terms of guidelines for the EU, I think they're still valid. I think in the content of the guidelines we propose in the guidelines for the just transitions, which make the call for jobs that have that policies toward the transition are complemented with social protection measures, skill development measures, social dialogue, the promotion of collective bargaining, and all these issues. I think that is still very much relevant for the EU and the whole world. So in terms of guidelines, we have that instrument in the ILO. They're called the Guidelines for the Just Transition to Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies for All. And what's interesting of that instrument is that it was developed by tripartite actors and after a tripartite dialogue. So it takes into account not only the view of government or the view of the ILO as an international organization, but particularly the views of workers and employers. So in that context, I think it applies to the EU to ensure that the jobs that are created are not only but the jobs that are created and whatever happens to jobs that are lost promotes a just transition for everyone.
Thank you, Guillermo. Now we have another question, maybe more for Kirsten, but please, Guillermo, if you feel if you want to answer, go ahead. It's asking that the model is driven by investment and changing demand, but however, skills training and investment into human capital is key in driving capital investment. So the question is, can this be modeled?
I can answer that.
Yep.
So I completely share the premise that human capital is key for this development, and it's correct that in this model we assume that all investments are capital investments, not not physical capital investments, not human capital investments, and these are key to promote the development and the transition. Now, in the model in particular, we assume, if you recall when we mentioned the assumptions, that the labor market is completely fluid and will adapt almost immediately to this to meet the new demand. So in particular, we don't model human capital development. Can it be to allow? So, well, again, the main lesson there is that for these scenarios to be achieved, we need to make sure that the skills development is progresses in par with the capital investments and the requirements in labor that happen. So can these be modeled in the model? So, and Kirsten can correct me if I'm wrong. Employment is distinguished by skill level in XIO base. So there's the possibility of distinguishing to what extent the demand for labor is for low skilled, middle skilled, or high skilled jobs, and to the extent that we can capture investment and the development of these in XIO base, then we could. Now, the one issue is that employment is a satellite account, so in a sense it is a consequence of whatever happens in the input-output analysis and not an input to it. But again, Kirsten can correct me if I'm wrong, and please do if I am.
Okay, Kirsten, would you like to add something to Guillermo's answer?
Hi. Guillermo's answer was perfect. Yeah, the outcomes of our results just show what the demand for labor and the skill levels and the different industries, which is still not occupations, would be. So we would need to have another model looking specifically at human capital development and the projections there to actually see if we are able to meet the demand for employment that we project in our model.
Okay, thank you. And now maybe, Kirsten, you can take this question from Felix, who is from ZIPAR, one GAIN member. And he's asking that how the regional input-output table generated and harmonized in settings with poor or outdated data can be improved. So his question is based on the fact that Zambia, his country, has IoT tables that are based on 2010 data, which might not tell a good story. Could you expand a bit on the challenges that data inaccuracy or data and reliability can have on this modeling scenario?
That's not only a problem for Zambia, but for most countries. National Statistical Offices only publish the input-output tables every 5 years. If it's about news tables, they may publish it every year, but still with a lag of 3 or 4 years. And only then are the tables integrated into the global tables. The trade data is available on with a smaller time lag. But one of the assumptions, and one thing that you can actually see if you have a time series of tables, is that especially if you have very aggregated industries, like not 163, but possibly only 20 or 30 or 40, 40 industries like they have in the WIAT database or in the OECD database, is that these structures, these input structures, change rather slowly, while final demand and the size of final demand including household and government and investments, that's what changes a lot quicker, the size, than the structures within the table. So yes, we always need to consider also, especially when doing the projections, that there might be more changes than we see, but there may also not be more changes. We just, for the future, we simply don't know, and for the past, we have to consider that there may have changes occurred over the past 5 years since the table was published.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now we're approaching the end of the session. I would just like ask one more question, and then we will end the session. So this is from Daniel in the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth. Maybe for Guillermo, he's asking that how is this transition affecting differently specific groups and also more fragile groups? And also, what is the role of skills in this transition, specifically for these maybe more vulnerable groups?
Yeah, so yes, that's a very good question, and it gets to the core of the detail that we need in these analyses. So these analyses are quite interesting because they paint a very broad picture, but they fail to pinpoint the issues that are particularly relevant in terms of job quality or in terms of specific groups, say the low-skilled youth or women. So to the extent that data is available, this is possible to do. And in Exiobase, we have data for female employment and male employment, and to a large extent, what we see is that the female share of employment, if nothing is done, again, assuming things continue pretty much the same except for the scenario that we've implemented, female employment will likely reduce, and this is because the industries that tend to develop further in the 2-degree scenario are male-dominated industries. Now, that's not necessarily the case. That will happen if we don't do anything to remediate these trends, and the same is true for skills. So the big lesson there is that this scenario points the direction to which things will move if nothing else changes, but we have the ability to change these things. So in terms of female employment, or in terms of those countries that may have net employment losses, this is a call to adopt policies to remediate those trends and direct developments towards a more inclusive form. Now, in terms of skills, that is a key issue, and again, it goes back to one of the assumptions that we have talked about quite several times already, is that the labor market adjusts to this change in demand. So we only model change in demand, and we assume that the supply of labor will meet that demand. Now, that means that, in particularly when it comes to skills, that workers will have the skills to be employed by wind farms or the manufacture and installation and maintenance of solar panels. But that's not necessarily the case. And one case in point, I'm from Chile originally, and Chile has developed quite rapidly and emphatically the renewable sector, particularly the solar photovoltaic, in the first years. And they did that, and they realized that there was no one in the country to install the solar panels, so they had to bring workers from Poland to install them. Now, that was a big loss of opportunity in terms of employment and capacity building. That's because the skills were not there in the country. So these policies, all this to say, basically the big takeaway for me is that these scenarios are very useful, but we need to complement them with policies that ensure that the skills are there, that social protection is there, that decent work comes with them.
Okay. Thanks a lot for raising these interesting points. I'm afraid now we are actually a bit over time, so we need to close here, and I think this is a good place to end this first webinar of the GAIN webinar series. Please stay tuned, because we will have more webinars within this series, and we will keep you updated. Now we will follow up later on this year, later on with a record of this webinar. And just to finish, I would like to ask Mustafa, Kirsten, and Guillermo for sharing their experience today here with us. Also to Fatma, who helped us with the technical aspects of the webinar, and of course to our attendees. And thank you for your attendance and participation. And now, on behalf of the ILO Green Jobs program and also the GAIN network, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.